The night Marcus Hale walked into the Meridian Awards Gala with his new fiancée on his arm, he looked like a man who had never once doubted himself. That was always his gift, the absolute unshakable confidence of someone who had never had to earn it. Diane Osei watched him from across the room and felt nothing. Not anger, not the old familiar ache. Just the quiet certainty that tonight 4 years of patience were finally going to pay off. She had met Marcus 11 years ago at a product design conference in Vancouver. She was 31, freshly promoted to senior UX researcher at a mid-sized consultancy called Bridgepath, and she had just finished presenting a paper on adaptive interface architecture, a framework she had been quietly developing for 3 years on nights and weekends, long after everyone else had gone home. Marcus was in the audience. He was charming and quick, the kind of man who could make you feel like the only person in a room full of hundreds. He came up to her afterward with a glass of white wine and said, "That framework is going to change how the whole industry thinks about user experience." She should have noticed even then that he said that framework, not your framework. They were married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Kelowna. Her mother flew in from Accra. His family filled 3 pews. It was, by most measures, a happy wedding. What nobody saw, what Diane herself did not fully see until much later, was the pattern that had already begun. Bridgepath had a client problem. A major telecom company, one of the big 3, wanted to redesign their entire customer service ecosystem from the ground up. It was the kind of contract that could define a consultancy's reputation for a decade. The pitch meeting was in 6 weeks. Marcus was the account lead. He came home one Tuesday evening, sat across from Diane at the kitchen table and said, "I need your brain on this." She was used to that. She'd always been the quiet engine behind his loudest wins. When he was stuck, she unstuck him. When his proposals felt thin, she made them substantial. She told herself this was partnership, that they were building something together. She spent the next 3 weeks rebuilding her adaptive framework specifically for telecommunications architecture. She mapped user pain points across 12 different customer journey stages. She designed an entirely new escalation logic, something she called a layered empathy model, that would allow automated systems to detect when a customer was becoming distressed and route them to human agents before they ever had to ask. It was genuinely new thinking. She knew it. Her colleagues knew it. The night before the pitch, she handed Marcus a 46-page document. He read it at the kitchen island with a beer, nodding slowly, and said, "This is brilliant, Dee. This is exactly it." The next morning, she waited at Bridgepath's offices while he went to the client meeting alone. She had assumed she would be presenting alongside him. That had been the plan, loosely. But Marcus had said quietly over breakfast that the client preferred a single point of contact, that too many voices could muddy a pitch, that she'd done the real work. The presentation was just theater. She sat at her desk and told herself he was probably right. An hour later, Marcus walked back into the office and the room erupted. The telecom client had signed a letter of intent on the spot. People were shaking his hand. Someone opened a bottle of champagne. The managing director clapped Marcus on the shoulder and said, "Absolute genius. Where do you come up with this stuff?" Marcus smiled. "You know how it is. You just have to think differently." Diane stood in the doorway of the boardroom, champagne flute in hand, and waited for him to turn around and say something. He did, eventually. He smiled at her from across the room, a warm, private smile, and mouthed, "We did it." She told herself that was enough. It wasn't enough. The telecom contract was worth $4.2 million over 18 months. Marcus was named partner. His photo went up on the company website. In the write-up, her framework was described as an innovative approach developed by the Bridgepath team under Marcus Hale's leadership. She read that line 4 times. Each time she felt something shift slightly in her chest, like a floorboard quietly giving way. But she stayed. She told herself it was early. That credit would come. That marriages were long and she was being small about it. Her mother called from Accra and Diane said everything was wonderful. Over the next 2 years, the pattern repeated itself 3 more times. Her research, her models, her late nights became Marcus's presentations, Marcus's promotions, Marcus's reputation. She was always there, in the background, described in meetings as my wife, who helps me with the technical side of things. As though she were someone who answered emails and double-checked his spelling. Not the person who had built the architecture he was selling. The 3rd time it happened, she didn't say anything in the meeting. She waited until they got home. "You described me as support staff," she said, in front of the entire client. Marcus set his keys down on the counter. "Di, that's not what you said I help with the technical side of things. I am the technical side of things." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said carefully, "You know I value what you do, but clients don't want to hear that their account lead's wife is the one running the show. It makes them nervous. It makes you look like you need me." He didn't answer that. She lay awake that night for a long time. She thought about the 46-page document. She thought about the champagne she'd drunk while standing in a doorway. She thought about the word partnership and how differently two people could define it. And quietly, without drama, without telling anyone, she began to keep records. It wasn't revenge she was planning. She wouldn't have called it that, not then. It was more like insurance. A woman who has been told her contributions are invisible learns eventually to document them. She kept dated copies of everything. Every brief, every wireframe, every research file with its metadata intact, every email thread where Marcus asked her to take a look at something and she had in fact rebuilt it from the ground up. She kept a private drive. She labeled it archive and told herself she hoped she never needed it. She needed it 18 months later. Marcus came home on a Thursday evening in March, looking like a man who had just survived something. He sat down in the kitchen, and Diane poured 2 glasses of water, and he told her that Bridgepath had been approached by a venture firm out of Toronto. They wanted to spin out the layered empathy model into a standalone product, a SaaS platform for enterprise customer service. The valuation conversation had started at $12 million. That's my model, Diane said. Her voice was very calm. It's the firm's IP, Marcus said. Everything developed under the Bridgepath umbrella. I developed it before Bridgepath. You know that, I have the files. Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, more like recalculation. Dee said, this is a business conversation, it's not personal. She looked at him for a long time. Okay, she said. 2 weeks later, Marcus filed for divorce. She wasn't surprised. She had felt it coming the way you feel a change in weather. That particular stillness before something breaks. What surprised her was the speed of everything that followed. He moved out within a month. Within 3 months, he was publicly dating a woman named Claire, a marketing director at one of Bridgepath's partner firms. Within 6 months, Diane was clearing out the last of her things from their Kitsilano condo and signing a lease on a smaller place in East Vancouver. Her colleagues at Bridgepath were careful around her. Polite, sympathetic in the way people are when they've already decided whose side they're on and it isn't yours. She took a leave of absence. She worked from home for 4 months. She went through her archive, file by file, and she built a case. Not out of spite, but out of the methodical habit of a woman who had spent a decade documenting other people's systems and knew exactly what good evidence looked like. Then she got a lawyer. Her name was Rebecca Cho, a sharp, economical woman in her late 40s who specialized in IP disputes and had a reputation in Vancouver's tech scene for being impossible to rattle. Rebecca read through Diane's files over 2 days and called back on the 3rd morning and said, "You have a very strong case. This is going to take time." "Are you prepared for that?" Diane said she was. "One more thing," Rebecca said. "Do you know a man named Thomas Adesanya?" Diane did not. "He does. He's one of the venture partners from Toronto. He's been asking questions about the origin of the layered empathy model. Apparently, he's not entirely satisfied with what Marcus has told him." Diane was quiet for a moment. "What kind of questions?" she asked. "The kind that suggest he already suspects something," Rebecca said. Thomas Adesanya had built his first company in his 20s in Mississauga, sold it at 33, and spent the next 15 years building a venture portfolio that read like a short list of the most important technology infrastructure companies in Canada. He was 60 now, lean and unhurried, with the kind of attention that made people feel simultaneously seen and measured. He had been involved in 3 public IP disputes in his career and had been on the right side of all 3. He and Diane met for the first time at a coffee shop on Cambie Street on a Tuesday afternoon in October, almost 2 years after the divorce. He had reached out through Rebecca. He said he had some questions. He had many questions. They talked for 2.5 hours. At the end, he set down his coffee cup and said, "The metadata on those files goes back 7 years before the Bridgepath contract was signed." "Yes," Diane said, "and Marcus knew this. He was there when I built it." Thomas looked out the window at the street for a moment. Then he said, "I've been investing in technology for a long time. The people who actually build things have a particular way of talking about their own work. They get into details that other people can't access because they didn't do the work." He paused. "Marcus doesn't talk about this model that way." "You do." Diane didn't say anything. "There's an awards gala next month," he said. "The Meridian. You know it?" She did. The Meridian Awards were the closest thing Vancouver's tech and design industry had to a proper institution. 30 years old, black tie, half the city's serious money in the same room for one evening. "Marcus is being recognized this year," Thomas said. "Innovation in customer experience design. The model is going to be central to his acceptance." Diane set down her own cup very carefully. "I'll be there," Thomas said. "I'd like you to be there too." The Meridian Gala was held at the Vancouver Convention Center, the West Building, with the harbor visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass. 400 people, the kind of event where everyone is performing a version of themselves. The women in long gowns, the men in their best suits, the quiet, constant hum of ambition dressed up as celebration. Diane arrived at 8 o'clock. She wore a deep burgundy dress that her friend Yemi had insisted upon, and she had her hair done for the first time in months, and she looked, by any measure like a woman who belonged there. Which she did, though few in the room that night had yet fully registered that fact. She saw Marcus the moment she walked in. He was near the bar, laughing at something, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of red wine. He looked exactly like a man who had never once doubted himself. Beside him was Claire, in a pale blue dress, touching his arm with the proprietary ease of someone who had recently started attending events like this and found she liked them. Marcus turned at some point, she wasn't sure when, and their eyes met across the room. She watched something flicker through his expression. Not guilt, not fear. More like a recalculation, the same one she had seen at the kitchen table 2 years ago, the same one she had watched him make so many times over so many years. The brief, practiced adjustment of a man who has learned to manage situations. He nodded at her politely. She nodded back. Then she went to find Thomas. He was standing near the windows with 2 other people she didn't know. A woman from Montreal who turned out to be the chair of the awards committee, and a journalist from the Globe and Mail who covered Canadian technology. Introductions were made. Drinks were refreshed. The journalist, whose name was Paul, mentioned that he had done some background reading on the layered empathy model and had found some inconsistencies in the public record that he hadn't been able to fully explain. Diane said quietly that she might be able to help with that. Paul looked at her with the particular attention of a person who has just realized a conversation is more interesting than he expected. I built it, she said, the model. I have documentation going back 9 years. Thomas said nothing. He had known. He had already arranged for certain files to be shared with Paul earlier that week, through Rebecca. But there is a difference between reading documentation and hearing someone say it plainly, in their own voice, in a room full of people. Paul said, "Does Marcus know you're here?" "He saw me when I walked in," Diane said. The awards ceremony began at 9. There were 12 categories. Marcus was 7th. When his name was called, the room applauded warmly. He was well liked, that was always true. He walked to the podium with the easy stride of a man who had rehearsed this moment privately many times. He thanked Bridgepath. He thanked the venture partners in Toronto. He talked about innovation. He talked about the future of customer experience design. He said, "The model we built starts with a simple premise that the moment a person becomes distressed, the system should already know. The model we built." Diane stood near the back of the room. She was very still. Thomas was 2 rows from the front. He stood up before the applause had fully subsided, which was unusual enough that people near him turned to look. "I'd like to say something," he said. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone with money speaks. The awards host, a veteran MC named Sandra who had been doing this for 15 years, had the presence of mind to gesture toward the microphone. Thomas walked to the front of the room unhurriedly. He thanked Sandra. He turned to face the room. "Marcus is a talented businessman," he said, "and I want to be clear about that. But the work we're celebrating tonight, the layered empathy model, the architecture that the Meridian Committee has recognized, that work was created by someone else." He paused. "By someone who is in this room." The silence that followed was the kind Diane had once described to Yemi as load-bearing. The kind that holds something up. Diane Osi, Thomas said, developed this framework over 3 years before it was ever brought to Bridgepath. She has 9 years of timestamped documentation. Her lawyer has already filed a formal IP claim. I've reviewed the evidence personally, and I can tell you it is unambiguous. He turned and looked directly at Diane across the length of the room. "This recognition belongs to you," he said. The applause began slowly. Then it wasn't slow at all. She would remember afterward many small details of what happened in the next few minutes. The way the woman from Montreal touched her arm as she walked toward the front. The way the journalist Paul had his phone out, recording. The way Sandra, professional to her bones, simply handed Diane the award as she reached the podium, as though this had always been the plan. She would remember Marcus's face. He was still standing near the podium. He had never fully left, and when she walked up he stepped back. Once, the way people step back from something they don't know how to process. He looked, for the first time in all the years she had known him, like a man who was out of his depth. Not angry. Not performatively calm. Just, still, as though the recalculation was happening and coming up empty. She would remember Thomas walking to her side and shaking her hand in front of the room, a formal, deliberate gesture. The kind that means something in the world where he moved. And then he did something she had not anticipated. He leaned forward and kissed her on the cheek, the way an old friend might, and said quietly, near her ear, "You should have been standing here a long time ago." It was the most public acknowledgement she had ever received. She heard Claire say something across the room, something sharp and confused, and she heard Marcus's voice, low, saying "not now," and she did not look in that direction. She looked out at the room instead. 400 people in their best versions of themselves watching her. She held the award with both hands and she said, simply, "Thank you." The story did not end that night, because these stories never do. The IP claim took another 8 months to resolve. There were depositions and counterfilings and a mediation session in a glass-walled room in downtown Toronto that lasted 11 hours. Marcus did not fight it to the end. His lawyer at some point advised him plainly that the documentation was too strong, and the public record too clear, and that a prolonged legal battle would cost him more. In reputation in the venture partnership in the Fiancée, who had already quietly moved out of the Kitsilano condo. The settlement was confidential in its specific terms. What was not confidential was the correction that ran in 2 trade publications and 1 national newspaper, establishing Diane Ossie as the original architect of the layered empathy model. Rebecca Cho framed that correction and put it on her office wall next to her bar certificate. Diane moved into a new apartment in Yaletown. She took on 3 consulting clients within 6 months of the settlement, all of them referred by Thomas, who seemed to have decided that backing her professionally was both the right thing to do, and as he put it once, very good business. She started a firm of her own, small, intentional, built carefully. Yemi threw her a party, nothing like a gala. 12 people in Yemi's living room in Commercial Drive, with good wine and bad karaoke and a cake that said finally in large buttercream letters. Diane laughed until her sides ached. She hadn't laughed like that in a very long time. Her mother called from Accra at midnight, which was early morning there, and Diane told her everything. The whole story, the way she had never quite told it before, the real version, without the careful edits she had always made to protect people who had never been particularly careful about protecting her. Her mother was quiet for a moment and then said, in Twi, the phrase that roughly translates as, "The one who planted it should also harvest it." Diane wrote it down in a notebook that she kept on her desk. She still has it. There are things she thinks about, sometimes on the late nights when the work slows down, and the city goes quiet outside her window, and there is nothing between her and the shape of the past. She thinks about why she stayed silent the first time. She has an answer for that now. A real one, not the careful version. She stayed because she loved him. And because love can make you undervalue your own certainty. And because there is a specific kind of trust that makes you believe that someone seeing your worth privately is the same as them acknowledging it publicly. It is not the same. She knows that now with the clarity of someone who learned it the hard way. She thinks about whether she would do it differently. The records she kept. The quiet years. Thomas calls it strategic patience, which is a phrase she likes but also finds slightly too tidy. It wasn't always strategic. Some of it was just survival. Some of it was just not being ready yet. She thinks that's worth saying plainly, because the cleaned-up version, the one where she knew all along and played the long game with perfect composure, isn't quite true. The truth is messier and more human. She documented things because something in her refused to let them disappear entirely. Even when she couldn't yet name what she was saving them for. She thinks about the moment Thomas said her name in that room. The way it landed. The way she felt it not as triumph exactly, but as something quieter and more durable. The sensation of being correctly known. She built something real. It took years and it took loss and it took the particular loneliness of doing important work in rooms where your name wasn't on the door. But she built it. The metadata doesn't lie. The work doesn't lie. And on that night in Vancouver, with the harbor dark and gleaming through the convention center windows and 400 people finally looking in the right direction, neither did the room.